Hello, my name is Vincent, and in this episode, let's paint an epic orc Squiggoth, here at Bunker 6. Now, I should have probably just used some debonding agent, but I didn't have any on me at the time, so I'm just using a scalpel blade to scrape away some superglue on the base of this model as it was secondhand. And because it's metal and it's going to be glued to plastic, if you can create some extra surface area for the glue to bite to, like I'm doing here by creating some extra scratches, that can just help make the bond a little bit stronger between the two surfaces. And as I'm sure it goes without saying, but please be very careful when you do a step like this, as the knife can slip very easily and go straight into your fingers if you're not careful. Now, if you're familiar with the Bunker 6 channel, you will know how much I love this glue. It's a gel-based super glue rather than just a regular liquid glue, and it just is a little bit more easy to manage. You won't need to wait longer than 5 minutes for this to be a strong enough bond to continue working on with this model. Just before I started recording this tutorial, I thought I'd broken my airbrush compressor because it wouldn't turn on. In actual fact, there was just a valve that I needed to release in order to let the air out, but sadly I didn't find this out until after I recorded the episode. Now, this is a great example of why I love this gel-based glue so much when it comes to the basing. When I used to use old-fashioned super glue, the liquid would just go all over the place. Due to the fact that it's a gel, you can easily put it where you want it to go and it will stay there, especially if you use a cocktail stick like I'm using here. And I'm just using some mixed sand on top of that, and it dries pretty much straight away. Now, you might find that there is an area where the glue didn't hit the base. Pretty easy to fix, you just need to get a little bit of super glue and add it back to the base, and then just add some additional sand on top of that. And while the glue is still wet preferably, you will want to try and scrape away any excess glue and sand that have gone onto the rim of the base that you do not want there. Now let's start painting the Squiggoth itself. We're going to start with this rather pinkish tone that I found in a Games Workshop publication for this particular model. If you just Google image search Epic Squiggoth, you'll see the model that I'm referencing. Because these are the legs, you're going to have a lot of additional painting going on afterwards, for example the metal plating and the basing itself, so you don't need to be too careful with what you're doing when you're painting these legs. Now we're going to move on to the black base coat. Anything that needs to be painted black is painted black now. Please be aware this isn't like a regular Games Workshop painting tutorial where everything is done one step at a time. There will be some back and forth where you've been painting one color, you might go back to it again later on in the tutorial. That happens a few times in this video, and I apologize for that, but there isn't necessarily an order to these things that I can follow as simply as a GW tutorial. I cannot recommend highly enough getting a pot of any of these Vallejo metal color paints. They're actually an airbrush paint, so they come out very thin, and I really appreciate that compared to the thickness of the GW metallics. They're a joy to work with, and the coverage is amazing. If you can get some, I highly recommend it. Now we're going to move on to the leather harness, which is on the underside of the Squiggoth to hold all the metal plating that sits atop it. Kind of like a horse in a saddle, really. Now, these parts can be a little bit tricky to get to because you've got the base in the way, and even if you didn't have the base in the way, you actually still have the metal parts that actually join the legs together that's in the way as well. So don't worry too much if you can't get to every little nook and cranny, because you're not really going to see it anyway. Now we're moving on to one of the lighter base coat tones, and in this instance we're going to be painting the canvas material and the rope that's holding the helmet to the Squiggoth's head. I find Ushabti bone is a wonderful mid-tone to strike a lovely balance between light and dark when it comes to these sort of canvassy materials. Now, because it's a lighter pigment, you're generally going to tend to have to do more than one coat. Just take your time, 2 or 3 coats, and you should have a lovely solid finish with this particular color. And although it wasn't on film too much, The canvas roll on the back top of the Squiggoth's harness section has been done off camera because a lot of my footage sadly was out of focus because I've been changing my setup around recently, and my apologies for that. I'm also going to be painting the Squiggoth's toes in the Ushabti bone as well, just to keep things simple and give it a little bit more continuity across the model. I read somewhere that it's very important to stay tidy throughout the entire painting project, and I couldn't agree more. If you see something that needs tidying up, do it immediately and it'll give you a much better result at the end. Now, because this is orc related, you can be a little bit heavy with the shading and the scuffing and the weathering because that's what orcs are all about. So we're going really thick with this particular shade just to give you this oily, slick sense that the Squiggoth is almost oozing its strength and anger on the battlefield. And you can see that it's going into all these lovely nooks and crannies very nicely, and it's going to dry really beautifully and give us that extra depth that the skin of the Squiggoth so truly deserves. Now this is a giant lizard with a massive gun on its back that's going to be walking through some very treacherous terrain. So let's imply that feeling with a brown tone around the feet and other areas that would require rust and grit and dirt. And on top of that, the brown is a lovely additional color that complements the deep red very well. And just to add further continuity, we're going to be using the exact same shade across all the metallics too, just to hold everything together. To make the red shade even more emphatic, we're actually going to go over with a brown shade around the rusty plate areas. It almost looks like these plates have been nailed into the Squiggoth's thighs and shoulder areas. And so we're going to make a sort of a brownish tone and hue happen around these areas to imply that this is rusted to the skin almost. Now with highlighting, you generally find that the brighter the highlight wants to go, the more narrow surface area that you're going to actually want to paint. Well, the same can be said for doing extreme shading too. You want to do multiple coats and make them smaller and smaller, and make those areas where you want to really pronounce the shade the most smallest part, but with the most layers. So that's what we're doing here. Now we're moving on to another base coat color, and we're just going to be doing the red here, using Evil Sun's red. Now normally you could start with a darker red. Because it's orcs, I wanted to keep things kind of bright and punchy, so we started with a lighter red like Evil Sun's red, and we're actually going to be doing some shading and then some additional highlights to it afterwards. As with all things when it comes to painting, please be patient and take your time. You're not necessarily, even with a small model like this, going to get the coverage that you want. So multiple layers is generally the key to getting a much better finish, rather than trying to slop a bunch of paint on in one go, thinking, well, it's a small model, so one, no one's going to notice, and two, well, it's, you know, a small surface area, so it's going to be covered easier. No, that's not necessarily the case, so just apply the same principles that you would to a large model to this scale model too. Now we're just going to highlight the canvas and rope areas with Vallejo's Pale Sand, a wonderful paint. I use it to mix up yellows and reds and everything because it's just a little bit of an off-white. It's not as bright as white, but it's getting close to it, and I really like the effect that it has. And speaking of white, we're going to be using Acryl Pro's Bold Titanium White. It's a very thin paint, but it's a nice paint and it's got a lovely flat finish to it. And once again, because it is a light pigment, you're going to need to do multiple coats, probably 4 before you see a result that you'll be very happy with. And just because it is a light pigment, don't fall into the trap of thinking you don't need to thin the paint, because you still need to thin the paint to keep the paint even and last a little bit longer too. So please keep that in mind while you're painting with whites and yellows and other light pigment colors like that. Now you can be quite messy here because you're going to be doing a lot of work with cleanup afterwards, because you've still got to do the checkerboard pattern on all of these white areas. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth with black and white paint, so don't be too concerned. Just don't obviously paint over areas that are finished already. Now we're just going to be doing a little bit of red base coating on the gun at the top here that I missed from earlier. Now it might seem odd that I went back to the white base coating, but I needed to let it fully dry before I could see what the coverage was looking like. That's why I moved on to the gun that needed to be painted still. And so you can see that actually the white needed additional layers, so that's what we're working on now. Now this is a nice easy step. We're just doing some edge highlighting on all of the leather parts, which is basically just on the undercarriage of the Squiggoth. Now my apologies, it's quite hard to see what I'm doing here because I didn't film it correctly, but I'm just adding a little bit of black paint between the creases of the rope. And then I'm adding a highlight of pale sand on the raised areas of the rope. And although it wasn't shot on camera, I also did a final highlight for the leather parts that you'll see in this shot on the undercarriage of the Squiggoth. We then moved on to the stud work that's also on the same leather strap. And then I just decided what else I wanted to be metallic and what I didn't want to be metallic. And so, as you can see here, the turret here is getting a little bit of metallic paint here and there on the edges, and anything that looks like sort of steel or iron works, and then everything else is left where it'll be either checkerboard or red paint or just black paint. Here I decided to do a final white highlight on the toes of the Squiggoth. Now this is by far the hardest part of the project, the checkerboard. The reason why it's difficult is because the actual areas that you're working in are so small to start with. Doing checkerboard at this scale isn't really the issue. It's about trying to keep it even when it's going over such a bendy shape, for example like the helmet. And also then you've got the deep ridged areas of the shield plating. Hitting the paintbrush in there to do straight lines can be quite tricky. To make this process as simple as possible, I highly recommend doing a sketch with a light layer of black paint first, and then you can always fill it in super duper afterwards. I highly recommend actually practicing on harlequins. If you've never painted a harlequin pattern before, once you've nailed that in, you can pretty much do any checkerboard style after that. Although it's a much bigger scale, it's still quite tricky because it has the 45-degree sort of twisted diamond style rather than a straight square, which in itself is a very big challenge if you haven't done it before. So maybe practice a harlequin before you move to 6mm scale checkerboard perhaps. Another reason to keep the paints thin is because if you start making mistakes, you're going to have to fix it with white paint, and you're going straight over black paint, so that's going to be a lot of layers. So you want to avoid that as often as possible, otherwise the surface is going to start to get lumpy and uneven and harder to paint on. And it's also just going to start demoralizing you. So you just want to make sure that you get it right first time or as close to first time as possible. No pressure, but just take your time and really know that you can fix the errors if you just make small errors to start with. Now we're moving back to shading the red. I'm using an extreme amount of Agrax Earthshade here because I want the contrast to be quite extreme in itself. Now these are orcs, so once again you can keep things nasty and dirty, it's part of the theme, but obviously don't put the Agrax Earthshade where you don't want it, and in this case we just kind of want it on the reds and the metallics and everything else to be avoided. And earlier I took a break from doing the checkerboard on the helmet because it was getting quite exhausting for my eyes, and now we're actually going back to that because I was ready to take it back on again. Also, I was a little bit concerned about trying to keep it symmetrical with the other side. I kind of gave up caring too much about that because you're never going to see both sides at once, but it turned out that I actually got them pretty equal nonetheless. So I ended up changing my technique. When I first started doing the checkerboards, I was just doing the squares without any type of grid lining or anything like that. In this case, I decided to go back to the grid lining just to see if it was making things any easier, and it absolutely did. Put some lines down first, and you're going to get better results much quicker. So you've got the grid to work with. Obviously, the squares aren't going to be even because of the grid lines, but you can fix that with a little bit of white paint afterwards. And here is the helmet finished. Now I decided to move back to the skin highlights. Now obviously when you put shade down, it's mostly recommended to add a little bit of the original base coat color back as your first highlight to make sure that the highlights aren't too extreme off the back of the shading. Makes things a little bit more natural, so that's what we're doing. We're just putting down some Screamer Pink on the raised areas again, and then we'll be hitting it with some Pink Horror, and then following up with a blend of Pink Horror and Pale Sand, 50-50 blend, to really make certain areas pop and shine. Now after the skin highlights, I decided to add a bit of brown around the top of the shoulder/thigh areas just to imply that that iron plate is rusting onto the skin. Now we're adding some vermilion from Vallejo just to bring out the reds after the original shade. Now I could have just used some of the Evil Sun's red, but we're actually going to be glazing the Evil Sun's red in from the Agrax to the vermilion, so it's a sort of a mid-tone contrast glaze between the two, and that's going to look really nice towards the end when we actually do a little bit more of this highlighting. And you'll see with all the paneled areas that are in red, I've tried to keep the highlights in the center because that's generally where you're going to find the panel to be the cleanest. All around the edges and in the recesses, things are going to get grungy and janky, and so the redness is going to be in the center and the dark browny tones will be further towards the edges. Aside from Evil Suns just being blended in a little bit here and there just to make the transitions a bit more smooth, I'm also going to end up using Vallejo Air Red, which is a lovely thin red, which is just to make the red pop, and because it's such a thin airbrush paint, it almost acts as a glaze too. Now some of the panels that don't have frames around them, I've made the actual highlights happen on the corners rather than in the center. The doors on the top of the turret are actually having the highlights pulled down to the bottom of them, just to imply that the top of the door is where all the dirt is sitting, and the bottom of the door is where it's going to be a little bit cleaner. Now to tie things together, we're just going to do highlights on all of the metallic silver areas, just to create a little bit more pop. Now for the rusty sections, I'm actually using regular brown paint rather than a wash, just because it gives you a much stronger contrast, whereas a wash sort of thins out. Obviously, the main difference with using a heavy pigment is you're implying that the rust itself is broken down metal rather than sort of the oily, dirty finish of a wash. Oranges, reddy browns, and tan colors make up the majority of what you'd want for a rust finish. As you can see, I'm pulling the paint into crevices rather than leaving it out on sort of flat surfaces. Rust will be developing in these crevices and nooks rather than on the flat, pointy areas, so we're going to pull the paint down into the darker areas to imply where water has been sitting, allowing rust to build up. Now we're going to highlight some of the black areas just to bring them out a little bit more. I like using dark Reaper rather than greys. I prefer a bluey black to a highlight rather than a grey black to a highlight. It's just a little less obvious, and it kind of gives a bit more of a pop at this scale, I think. So we're going to be using a dark Reaper glaze and then slowly adding white to bring out that glaze and highlight even further. As you will find with more and more epic that you paint, the key is really getting the contrast between different tones as extreme as possible to really make the model stand out, considering how small it is and how far away it will be from you when it's on the battlefield. Now sometimes when you're doing these high contrast sections, you can actually run into a problem where things start to look a little bit unrealistic. So what you can do is add a filter or a glaze, which is basically a mid-tone again that you just lace over the top of the surface to glue all of the different gradients together. And so you have a general tone that sort of tricks the eye a little bit, so you're not so focused on the massive contrast between the two colors that you are trying to transition between. And to save time and paint, I'm continuing to use this black glaze as a wash, just putting a little bit more black pigment in it so it sort of acts like Nuln oil, and basically trying to add a recess wash around all of the nuts and bolts that are on the Squiggoth. Now I decided to move back to doing some edge highlighting. I'm using vermilion and a mix of that with white, just to create a nice striking edge highlight on the red. And my apologies, I forgot to actually hit the record button when I was painting the gold cog that's on the back of the Squiggoth, but you can see it here briefly, and I just used a base coat of Brassy brass. And then I moved on to the fuel tank that's right next to it and painted that with a base coat of Vallejo olive green. I didn't end up actually doing any highlights on the cog or the fuel tank, as I didn't think it was particularly necessary due to their placement on the model and what they're trying to do. They're supposed to be getting old and dirty and dusty, and I actually just quite like the final tone, what both the parts had, with just a wash over the top of a base coat. So I decided the checkerboard was looking a little bit too clean for my liking. I mean, these are orcs we're talking about, so I decided to add a little bit of Nuln oil to the white areas in the lower sections just to imply that dirt had been dripping down slowly over these checkerboard areas, and it also just gives a nice little bit of contrast once again to the model. You can keep on adding layers of Nuln oil or black glazes in this method to imply an even more extreme contrast if you prefer. So I decided that I got quite bored of just having red, checkerboard and metallic panels all over the Squiggoth, so I thought I'd mix things up a little bit at the end with a white to black gradient panel that's on the front in these two triangular sections. All we did was multiple glazes of the white to the black and a mixture of grey in between, and then a black outline to tidy everything up. Now the easiest part of the project is painting the base. We've got a very simple process here, very cheap Liquitex burnt sienna paint as our base coat, and then we're going to follow up with a wash, multitude of pigments and paints. Now, as previously mentioned, this tutorial is all over the place. There's no solid steps over all the different parts. So I've actually jumped back now to doing the washes on the fuel canister and the gold shade as well. Now we're going back to the black highlights because I realized I missed a hatch on the top that I wanted to add a bit of highlighting to. Once again, it's just a mixture of dark Reaper, black paint, and white, depending on if you want to go darker or brighter. I just decided to go around the model and bump up all of the highlights a little bit more on all the black areas where I thought it was appropriate. So I decided to go with this very red desert theme because the orcs are an alien species, so I wanted to imply that they themselves were in an alien habitat somewhere in the universe. Now obviously you can base these models however you want, but after a lot of thought I decided that this was the best option for me. Once you've let the wash dry, you then start hitting it with highlights on the browns. Now one thing that I think is vitally important, and obviously it applies to regular model painting too, but especially with basing as well, you want to make sure that all of your tones match each other and complement each other. If you're doing a sort of a brown highlight, you want to make sure that it's not too yellow and it's not too red, because it needs to match the previous tone, otherwise things start looking unrealistic. Now this is my first attempt with pigments, and as you can see I made a big old splotch in the middle there. I'm just removing it with a bit of water just to dull it down a little bit, and I saved it, thankfully, but I was a little bit panicked at first. So I've got two different pigments here that I'm using, a darker one and then a lighter one in less areas. As you can imagine, the same can be done with paints as well. Once you're happy with the pigments, you can start using some gravel and pigment fixer. And finally, the last step, just painting the rim with some Steel Legion Drab. Water it down just a little bit as the paint can come out quite thick, and do about 3 coats nice and smooth with a big flat brush so you get a nice smooth finish. And I'd like to just do a big shout out to Mr. Savage for recommending me to paint this model for this episode. Thanks, buddy. Thank you ever so much for watching. I actually have 3 more epic Squiggoth that'll need painting for future episodes, and to spice things up a bit, we'll paint them each in a different style of an orc clan. That should be a lot of fun. Also, I have a Discord server now where we discuss everything Epic 40k related, and we have sub-channels for Warmaster, Battlefleet Gothic, Adeptus Titanicus, and Aeronautica Imperialis. If you have any questions regarding rules, 3D printing, or even basing, there'll be someone in the community, including myself, that'll be happy to help. As always, if you're new here, please consider subscribing, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, and maybe watch some of the other videos that are on this channel. Until next time though, I've been Vincent, signing off from here at Bunker 6.